Hello, and thanks for joining us. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to our webinar on setting the right rates for your small water system. My name is Tess Clark. I work here at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center, and this is a webinar that we co-developed with some great partners from the state of Minnesota in order to help those of you who are managers, utility staff, or decision makers for Minnesota systems. We'd like to start off by thanking our collaborators from the Minnesota Public Facilities Authority. The PFA can be a great resource if you have questions about financing water infrastructure in Minnesota. There is a URL on the slide, www.mn.gov/PFA, if you would like to learn more. Likewise, we'd also like to thank the Minnesota Department of Health. They are also a great resource for small water systems, and in particular, we have some information listed here for the Drinking Water Revolving Fund, which is a great program to be aware of as well. Moving on to some logistics, please keep in mind that everyone is on mute to ensure audio quality. I also want to draw your attention to the question dialog box on your GoToWebinar control panel. Please send us questions using that box. We will be sure to get in touch with you to answer your question, and we will have a few minutes for Q&A at the end of the webinar. We will also post today's presentation and a webinar recording on our website, esvnetwork.org. Registered attendees can receive a certificate of attendance for participating in this webinar today. This webinar has not been submitted to licensing agencies for continuing education credits. It is a courtesy certificate only. You must attend the entire 1-hour session, and you must log into the webinar on your tablet or computer using your unique join link. This is how we know that you attended. The certificate will arrive via email within 30 days of today's date, and you can always contact us at smallsystems@syr.edu if you have any questions about this. Now for a little bit about us. The Environmental Finance Center Network is a university-based network providing individualized technical assistance, workshops, small group support, webinars, and e-learning to small systems in all U.S. states and territories. We focus primarily on small water systems and helping those systems meet their goals and regulatory requirements. And here you can take a look at our small systems team. Like I said, we are a network of environmental finance centers, mostly based at universities across the country. For those of you in Minnesota, the Great Lakes Infrastructure Center at Michigan Tech is also located in EPA Region 5, if you're interested in your closest EFC. Our centers specialize in several areas of assistance important to water infrastructure, including asset management, fiscal planning, and rate setting, which you'll hear more about today. If you'd like to learn more, you can also subscribe to our blog. We share success stories from small systems across the country, as well as blogs about new tools and lessons learned. And finally, we have a great tool on our website that can help you find the major funding sources for drinking water projects in your state. Here's how you access those tables. On the home page, go to the Resources tab and hit Funding Sources by State. This will take you to a map of the country. If you click on the state that you're interested, in this case, you might click on Minnesota, you might find a PDF table of available funding sources. The table looks like the image on the left of the slide. That PDF will tell you the name of the funding program, a short description, and contact information for someone who works in that program. And if you have any questions about this, again, you can let us know at smallsystems@syr.edu. On that note, I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Jeff Hughes is the Director of the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He has 30 years of environmental finance experience as a policy analyst, consultant, and practitioner. Jeff is also an associate teaching professor with the UNC School of Government, where he teaches courses on environmental finance and policy. Prior to joining the UNC EFC, Jeff worked as a utility director for the Chatham County NC and as an international finance advisor with RTI International. So welcome, Jeff, and I'm going to make you a presenter so you can share your screen.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tess. Could you confirm that you can indeed see my screen now?
Yep, the screen looks great. Thanks.
Great. Well, as Tess said, welcome to the webinar, and we're going to spend the next 45 or 50 minutes talking about issues related to rate setting for small water systems. I put the word small in brackets. Most of what I'm going to talk about probably pertains as much to larger systems, but we won't go into as much detail about some more advanced rate setting that you might see in a larger urban area. We will focus primarily on the rate setting practices and procedures that are common for smaller water systems. Tess mentioned that I'm from the Environmental Finance Center at the UNC School of Government, and we do a variety of work in different areas and different media. But rate setting is one of our key areas, and I'll be sharing with you a lot of the work that I personally have done in this area, as well as some of the work of my colleagues. If you're interested in learning more about some of our general rate setting work, I invite you to go to environmentalfinance.org in addition to the URL that Tess mentioned for the entire Environmental Finance Network. This URL is for our website, and you'll find information about where we work, the kind of projects we do, and you'll see that it's our 20th birthday this year. One of the most common questions we get either through phone calls, at our training events, is, are our rates right? And we usually respond with the somewhat unsatisfactory answer that it depends. And the reason we answer is it depends, as you'll see in the next 45 minutes, there's a lot of considerations for rate setting. And without being aware of some of the local conditions and the considerations that small systems are facing, it's very difficult to know whether the rate structure they may have chosen in the past is really the best ones for them. So the rest of the session is really going to be helping you answer this question yourself. I will say that when you do have the right rates, a lot of positive things can happen. Communities that have worked hard with their rate setting tend to have adequate funds to support public health, adequate funds to support environmental protection. They can support their local policies. They have rates that have been well thought out to match what their leaders and what their community thinks are important, and the state policies as well, if that applies. Rates can also communicate with customers in a certain way, and they can convey positive messages that are intentional and that you want your customers to be aware of. And finally, you know, rates, probably one of the most important things rates do are they allocate costs in an intentional and fair way. On the other hand, if you come across a utility that hasn't looked at their rates in a long time, hasn't been willing to make some hard decisions, you often find, you know, what I would say is the wrong rates. You know, and these are rates that don't provide sufficient fund to support public health. These are rates where the utility leaders can't fix essential assets. They can't pay their staff the salaries they need to pay to recruit qualified staff. They're unable to do what they need to do for environmental protection. In some cases, we see rates that are contradictory to some sort of stated local goal. And they may communicate in an undesirable way to customers, and they may allocate costs unfairly. So you can see there's a lot at stakes with rate setting. I'm going to now go into some of the steps and some of the procedures that we work on with small water utilities across the country. I will ask that you already, if you're on the webinar, start thinking about what questions and rate setting challenges do you have? When you signed up for this webinar, what were you hoping that I would address? Go ahead and type that into the question dialog box now, and that way we'll have some interesting things to talk about at the end. And as Tess said, no matter what, we will get to these questions and we'll answer these questions the best we can and send out send out written documentation that answers every question that we got during the webinar. So please give us some ideas. This set of steps that you see on your screen now are what I call a recipe for rate happiness. These are just some of the big steps that we urge water utilities to consider when they look at their rates. I'm going to walk through some of these in more detail for the rest of the webinar, but I'll just quickly go over them now. Without knowing your assets and understanding what you have in the ground and your starting place, it's very difficult to know what your costs are going to be and to know what kind of rates are going to be appropriate to you. You need to know your local priorities and goals. There are a lot of different priorities out there, and there are different ways of meeting priorities that are customized to local communities. Rate setting is very mathematical. You have to know what your costs are to figure out how much money you need to raise. So it's really important to identify your true full costs. Water utilities are a business with customers. Any business needs to have customer knowledge to really provide the service and to price the service in a way that follows up with their goals. As most of you know in the field, rate setting, water utility management is very dynamic. We have changes, things aren't static, so we think it's important to do a little bit of gazing into a crystal ball whenever you sit down and work on rates. And only after you've done those steps can you really sit down and work on those, quote, right rates. Without that hard work in the beginning, it's going to be very difficult. So let's go in and see what some of these steps mean in practice. I'm not going to cover a lot of asset management material in this webinar, but I will say that that is one of the key services we offer as part of the small water system project that we're working on. In fact, last year we did a webinar specifically on asset management, so I bring it to your attention. We also have quite a bit of other resources on asset management, and some of our centers within our environmental finance network, that really is their specialty. But what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the session is much more related to cost accounting, communication, and then actual rate structures. It is important, though, to think clearly about what you want to get out of your rates. And this slide shows you some typical goals and priorities that utilities may have. And we know that when you look at these, you'll see things like full cost recovery, encouraging conservation, business friendly, maintaining affordability. We know that a lot of communities would love to have it all. And, you know, we understand that most utilities want to have at least some of these goals in their system. But what we do point out is there are trade-offs. There's no getting around that. At times, if you make hard decisions about full cost recovery, you may end up with higher rates. If you're trying to offer businesses in your community with lower rates to encourage recruitment of businesses, well, you might be sending pricing signals that don't promote water conservation. So any work in this area requires some trade-offs. Let's look at some of these in a little bit more detail. The conservation goal is something that's very geographic specific. At any given time in the country, we have states and communities where conservation is incredibly important, and we have other parts of the other parts of the country where it might not be nearly as pressing an issue. You know, I think this is the case in Minnesota. I do want to point out that Minnesota does have a statute related to conservation that does impact rate setting. So you are going to want to know what your state laws are related to these different types of policies. And in the case of Minnesota, if you're a utility serving more than 1,000 people, and you want to support and adhere to Minnesota law, which I hope you do, you're going to want to be aware that that is going to put some guidance on the rate structures. And in this case, it's going to promote you having either a uniform rate or a conservation rate structure. Similarly, there's things that might not relate specific to rate setting, but do eventually get back to pricing. And this is just another excerpt from the Minnesota statutes that covers when the governor does declare by executive order that there's a critical water deficiency, public water supply authorities must adopt and enforce water conservation restrictions. And we have seen in many of these drought areas that we've worked in that pricing play an important role in those water conservation strategies. So you do want to be aware of that. I'll get to some of the other priorities later on. But once let's just say that you've gone through and you've decided that in your particular situation, you want to promote conservation, you want to have full cost prices, you need to focus now on the cost side of your operations. It really is important to know your costs well. There are some costs that we find utilities always have a pretty good idea about. These are things like their current labor costs, supplies, benefits, utilities, electricity, water purchases, if they buy water from another community. You can usually find a good history of these expenditures, and when it gets to rate setting time, those are fairly easy to quantify. But there's also costs that are much more difficult to put your hands on when you sit down to do rate setting. These are some examples of costs that not everybody has easily accessible. It might be the indirect cost of running the water system. We find, particularly for small towns, that town management staff, the town clerk, or the town finance officer might spend a lot of their time on the water utility. That is a cost of providing water in that community, and we would recommend at least being aware of that cost and taking that into consideration when you're setting rates. And there are different ways of doing that. But first, just knowing that that is a real cost is important. There are other costs that are a lot more challenging for many small utilities. We know many small utilities have water leaks, have water theft, have non-revenue water costs. Trying to get a handle on those are important, and of course trying to reduce those. So that's another cost element to be aware of. The one that has dominated most of our work with small communities is getting a handle on capital-related costs. We find over and over again that many small communities have a hard time incorporating the true capital costs of running a water system into their rates. And by capital costs, it might be debt service, but many small systems don't borrow money, so there's no debt service. It might be the depreciation of assets. Is the utility taking into consideration the wear and tear of their assets that goes on every year, and are they putting money into a sinking fund to take care of that? Then there's other costs that really depend on state and local conditions, things like retirement and pension. We have worked with systems where these types of costs haven't been as transparent. Once you identify your costs, you're going to want to characterize them in different ways. And this is a really common way of thinking about costs for rate setting purposes. Some of your costs are going to be fixed costs. In other words, they're not going to be dependent on how much water you sell. Some of your costs are going to be variable. So one of the first things that we'll do with a utility is to take a list of their costs and go through with them and go figure out which ones will vary and which ones are fixed. And that will be important later on when you're trying to pick the appropriate rate structure. Now, I'm not going to go over every line item in the budget that you're seeing on your screen, but what is important to point out is this is a fairly typical budget. This is from a small utility that we worked with. And you can go through these costs, and hopefully these costs are familiar to many of you. And in this particular case, there's a little blue arrow that shows really the only capital cost that we could find in a historic budget for this town. And it was about $9,000 for a loan that they had taken out 5 or 6 years ago. I can guarantee that this utility has more than $9,000 worth of capital needs for a $382,000 budget. So it's just an example that using a budget is not always going to be the best way to figure out what your capital costs are. You're going to want to do asset management plans. You're going to want to look at depreciation schedules to really figure out what your true capital costs might be. With the costs that I just showed you, we did go through that and try to split those into different types of costs. And in this particular situation, we found that about $292,000 of that budget was fixed costs and $52,000 is variable. This is a really important thing to know going into rate setting. In this particular situation, this community is going to need almost $300,000 every year just to be a water utility. Then they're going to need about $52,000 to actually treat gallons of water. It's important because if for some reason this community lost half of their customers overnight, it doesn't mean that those purple side costs are going to go down by 50%. And we see that as a real problem for many small systems is they lose customers, they sell less water, and they're curious about why they're in such bad financial shape. And it's all about this slide that you're looking at. Most water utilities have high fixed costs, so you have to take that into consideration when you're setting rates. Talk a little bit more about capital costs. We recently did an analysis of all of the water utilities for the state of Wisconsin, and we looked at their finance reports, and we were able to determine that almost 70 or 80 of them did not collect rates sufficient to cover the cost of depreciation of their assets in a given year. And you can see this circled on the slide. What does that mean? That means that the rates that customers pay are covering operating costs, but they're not covering the needed capital. And this usually ends up causing significant problems, particularly if this is allowed to go on for year after year. This is what not including money for capital tends to look like out in the field. And this is just some photos from utilities that we've worked with over the last few years. And for every one of these utilities, it was a situation where the rates were generating enough money to cover basic salaries, basic labor, basic operating costs, but the utility leaders had very little money left over at the end to fix their assets, and this was the result of it. So it really is a public health and environmental issue if you're not accounting for capital in your rates. So let's now assume that you've done the hard work of studying your costs, you've looked at your capital costs, and you're starting to get an idea of the amount of money that you need to raise. Well, your customers are going to be where you turn to raise that revenue, and it's essential for you to understand your customers. These are some ideas that we suggest that you think about. Do you have a really good idea about what of your customers are residential versus non-residential? What types of non-residential customers do you have? Do you have schools? Do you have small businesses? Do you have large industries? Really understanding that breakdown. Do you know the income and economic status of your customers? We've seen the last few years as prices have gone up in many parts of the country, we've started to see collection rates drop. We've started to see affordability problems arise in a lot of areas. If this is going to be a problem for you, it's going to be important for you to identify that early on. How is your water used? Is it used for irrigation? Is it used for industrial production, tourism? All of these things are really important as you sit down to price it. What seasonality patterns do you have? Are you a resort community that has a lot of people in the summer using a lot of water and very little inhabitants in the winter? These things are all essential to know. Some of the things that we've seen really trip up some small systems is sudden departure of industries. And it's really important, if you're in the water business, to understand not only the amount of water that you're selling every year, but who are you selling it to? Are you selling it to an industry that has had real financial challenges over the last few years? Are you ready for that industry to overnight shutter their doors? And, you know, we hope that doesn't happen, but we've seen it happen enough, and we've seen utilities completely surprised by it, that we really urge a lot of attention to understanding your customers. And finally, we want you to understand the population and usage trends both in the past and in the future. And this goes into the crystal ball, the forecasting, the future that we talked about. So let's show you some examples. This is just a really basic example, but most small water systems have a blend of customers. You know, you'll have your customers that use 4,000 gallons a month every month, all year long, and most of that water is for indoor use. You'll have your customers on the upper right that in the summer maybe use 15,000 gallons because they have fountains and they do irrigation, but then in the winter they're only using 4,000 gallons. You may have large families that are using 15,000 gallons every month all year long, and then you may have small businesses. Each of these customers is going to react differently to different pricing changes. Each of the customers are going to give you different revenue flows over a 12-month period and over a future time horizon. So really important to think about customers like this. This is an example on your screen now of a financial analysis we did for a utility in Wisconsin. We have the benefit of, in Wisconsin, we work with the State Public Service Commission on a statewide financial database that water utilities use for rate setting purposes. You'll see that kind of screenshot up there in the top right. But if you look at the bottom of the slide, you'll see we collect for Wisconsin information on things like median household income and poverty rate. And in this particular situation, if you look at the utility called Fairchild Village, you see that they have a very high poverty rate, over 20%, and a very low median household income compared to all of the other utilities throughout Wisconsin. This is important information that you need to know as you sit down to make pricing changes, because this very well could have an impact on how these customers react to certain types of rate structures. Just one of many unfortunate headlines we see all across the country, the loss of a water using industry. In this particular case, it's in Grand Rapids. But we see this all throughout small rural America as well. The one or two large industries that have been both large employers but also large water users might suddenly close their doors, or we're starting to see this. They may stay open, but they may suddenly use half as much water as they used the year before. What's happened? Well, they might have made a technology investment on their industry grounds that uses recycled water for part of their processes. And a lot of small water systems don't think to communicate with their large water customers to understand if they are indeed even evaluating those types of water saving investments. So again, something that if you do have these types of customers in your service area, you want to be on really good terms with the people that run these facilities. This is an example of a very simple residential water use analysis that is really essential to do before you talk about setting rates. In this particular case, what we've done is work with a utility to just identify how many customers they have that use different amounts of water every month. And you can see by looking at this chart that the vast majority of customers in this particular utility use 5,000 gallons of water or less per month. And there's a relatively small number of customers that use between 5,000 and 10,000, and only a handful that use 10,000 and above. If you're going to do a rate structure change and you don't have information like this, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to do any kind of educated revenue projection. So something like this is really an absolute, absolute requirement to setting good rates. This is an example of a population analysis we did in partnership with a small community. They didn't understand why it had become so difficult for them to meet their costs. And while this might seem like an obvious analysis, when we put it like this, it was really shocking. And what you're seeing on your screen here is the number of customers they had each year since 2002. And you can just see on this chart just a really steady decline year after year of people in this particular community moving out and not having people move in. And again, this is an unfortunate trend that we see in many small water systems. It's one that makes for rate setting to be very, very difficult, but it is one that you need to be aware of when you set your rates. I will just point out that what you might be wondering what that sudden drop is. In 2017, I'm from the state of North Carolina. That's what happens when a major hurricane hits your community. And in this case, a major hurricane came through, and overnight, this community that already was losing customers lost an additional 100 customers who had to move out, many of who decided not to move back. So these are the kinds of demographic analysis that we are increasingly urging both small and large water systems to do when they're doing rate setting. I'm going to spend most of the rest of the webinar talking about some specific rate structures and rate setting decisions that small systems should be considering. We often call rate setting an art. This is just an excerpt from an article I wrote years ago. In my career, I found that you have to be on top of accounting. You have to be a good financial manager to do rate setting, but you also have to have some political, some social, some creativity. There really is an artistic component of rate setting. It's in some ways an accounting science, but there's a lot of art to it. And I'll just show you some of the decisions you'll have to make, and you'll be able to see where the art and the creativity and the discretion is going to come in. But with that said, there's definitely things that you should do and things that you shouldn't do. I'm going to talk about some of the biggest decisions that you're going to have to make. And on this slide that you're looking at now, I'm just highlighting some of the decisions that you're going to have to make when you sit down to do rate setting. The first one may seem very obvious, but it is the most important one. Are you going to go to the effort to figure out what costs you need, and are you determined to raise the money to meet those costs? We find many, many small systems that are either unable or unwilling to identify all their costs, or once they do identify all their costs, they look at that number and they shrug their shoulders. And I understand that, but that is a decision. If you shrug your shoulders and say, we're a small system, we know we need $200,000 a year, but there's no way we can do that, we're going to go for trying to raise $150,000 a year, that's fine, but you've just made a very important rate setting decision, and there's going to be repercussions of that decision. And some of the slides I showed you earlier with the assets that fall apart or fall into disrepair, that is due to utilities being unable or unwilling to cover all of the costs they need through their rates. But let's just say you do make that really hard decision to cover all the costs you need. There's still plenty of hard decisions you have to make. The ones that I think are most important for small water systems are how much of that revenue or cost that you want to cover are you going to generate by a base charge, and how much are you going to generate by a volumetric charge? I would argue that those top three decisions are the most important. There's other decisions. There's plenty of other decisions related to rate setting. Are you going to have different customer classes? Are you going to have different types of rate structures? There are some very complex rate structures out there that you may want to consider. I will talk a little bit about those three at the bottom, but I'm really going to focus on number 2 and number 3 on this list. So let's get down to work. You decide that you need a certain amount of money. Now you are deciding how are you going to allocate those costs to your customers. And by far the most common rate structure we see is a uniform volumetric charge that the price per gallon of water, per 1,000 gallons of water, per 100 cubic feet of water is uniform. And there's a base charge. And you can see a little graph of this on the right side of your screen. You can see that it doesn't matter whether you only buy 1,000 gallons of water or you buy 5,000 gallons of water, you're going to pay $3 for every 1,000 gallons of water you buy. And this is what the customer bill spread looks like on the lower right-hand corner. You'll see that there's a base charge where if they don't use any water, they're still paying something, and then it just goes up based on how much water they use. A very powerful and simple rate structure that can be modified in a lot of different ways depending on how you set the base charge and how much you decide to collect in the volumetric charge. Let's look at an example from Minnesota. I don't think they're on the call, but this is one we found from the city of Dawson, Minnesota. It's a residential water bill, and you can see that they have this type of base charge and uniform variable charge after that. The base charge in this particular community is at $19.50, and it just goes up from there. Someone that uses 5,000 gallons of water will pay $48.50 in this community, and someone that uses 15,000 gallons a month will pay $106. A really solid rate structure. Is this a conservation rate structure? I would argue that it very well could be. You'll see the price down here is $5.80 per 1,000 gallons. That's a pretty high unit price. Most consumers would like to save $5.80 by saving 1,000 gallons of water. So that price is probably high enough to encourage some conservation. If that price was at $2 or $1, I'm not so sure I would call this a conservation rate structure. Let's now say that the city of Dawson decides that they have much more costs than they had been generally assuming in the past. What can they do? Well, one of the most easy ways to adjust their rates are to just adjust the base charge and keep the same volumetric charge. And this green line that I just popped up on the screen in front of you shows a representation of what that new rate structure might look like. And you'll see that that rate structure, it's very similar to the old rate structure, but it will generate a lot of new revenue. You'll see the folks that don't use very much water at all are going to have their water bill go up quite a bit. And you'll see the folks at $48.50 will have their water bill go up. In general, this is a great structure if Dawson is in need of a lot more revenue for some reason. But maybe Dawson doesn't need more revenue. Maybe they're just concerned about adjusting their rate structure to change a policy or to change the allocation of who pays how much in their customer base. They can continue to use a base charge and uniform rate structure, but they can make some other adjustments. In this particular example, I'm showing that the community raises their base charge, and you can see this in the dotted green line. They go from $19.50 to say $38, but then what they've done is they've actually lowered their unit cost. So I don't know what this actually comes out to be, but it's certainly going to be less than $5.80. You know, let's just say for argument's sake, they might have lowered it down to $4 per 1,000 gallons. What you will see happening is different customers will pay different amounts under this rate structure. But when the smoke clears, I wouldn't be surprised if this new rate structure generates about the same revenue as the old rate structure. And I say that because you can see that for the average user, this rate structure doesn't even mean much of a change. But for a low user, this rate structure means that people are paying more. And for high users, they're paying less. Why in the world would you do a rate structure like this? Well, if Dawson is concerned about revenue stability, having a higher base charge is going to give them much more stability in their revenues. What that would mean would be customers are going to be paying an amount of money every year, and every month, regardless of how much water they use. Dawson can count on that. They don't have to worry about sudden conservation dips. If it's a rainy summer and folks are using a lot less water, they won't see quite as much of a dip in their overall revenue. So that might be the reason they did this. But what if the reverse is true? What if this community wants to send pricing signals to their customers? What if it's in a drought and they really want to get people to use less water, particularly the users that were using 15, 10, 20,000 gallons a month? Well, they can adjust it the opposite way. They could reduce the base charge and then increase the variable charge. Let's say, for argument's sake, they could increase it to $7 per 1,000 gallons. And I don't know if that's exactly what this comes out to be, but if they did do that, it would mean that low users would even pay less under this rate structure. But look what happens under this change. Some of the high users are paying considerably more money. So this would be a way for this community to change their rate structure fairly simply, but with pretty significant results. There are many, many ways to change rate structures in a more complicated way than what I just showed. Hopefully what I showed, though, was that even with some simple changes, you can have some drastic results. You can change the way different customers pay. You can encourage different types of usages. But if for whatever reason that simpler rate structure is not sufficient for your needs, there are more things that you can do in the rate setting toolbox. I'm not going to go over a lot of details about these techniques, but you certainly can find more tools on our website, and you can always call us. And we do work occasionally with small water systems that like to at least entertain some more complicated pricing structures. But there is an increasing block pricing structure that many larger communities that have less expensive water have migrated to. This is a way for you to send a pricing signal even if your average cost of water is very low. Again, we don't see these rate structures as often in the small systems, but they're certainly possible. In this particular case, you might have the folks that use 10,000 gallons and above might pay $5 for their 1,000 gallons of water, every 1,000 gallons of water they use. And the folks that use a very small amount of water may pay $2 per 1,000 gallons. That's what an increasing block rate structure is. A decreasing block rate structure is the reverse. we really urge folks to move away from those decreasing block rate structures. They don't follow the cost of water very accurately. They don't encourage conservation. They might recruit businesses, but if that's really an issue for a community, we would probably recommend that the community consider a special industrial rate rather than just going to a decreasing block rate structure. There are seasonal rate structures. There are surcharges where during a drought you pay a little bit more. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but if you have questions, I'm happy to talk about those. There are other things that are important with the idea of setting the right rates. It's not just setting the right rates, it's having the right frequency of adjustments. Do you want to bill on a monthly basis? Do you want to change your rate structure every year or every 5 years? This first bullet is really important. We really recommend more frequent rate adjustments. The utilities that follow the every 5 years, we're going to look at our rates, seem to always be behind. They come up with a rate projection that governing boards have a hard time approving because they're so high, because they haven't raised rates in so long. So they end up getting rates approved that are below what they need, but they still can't go back for another rate increase for another 4 or 5 years. So we really see folks having a hard time that are in that cycle of every 5, every 10 years. We've even seen that rate adjustments. Communication and public rate relations are essential. If you're not communicating how important water is, you're going to have a hard time communicating how important it is to pay your bill or how important it is to pay a potentially increased bill. Frequency of billing is an important decision. As you have higher bills, having bills that are read and sent out every 4 months, you may save a little money on postage, but when you get to have bills that are $80, $90, $100 a month, which we have started to see for some small water systems, that is really causing sticker shock to send somebody out a bill that is for $300 or $400 every three or 4 months in some cases. So these types of management decisions we really urge utilities to think about. There are software considerations, there are collection policies, how strict are you going to be? We find that if you're not strict enough, you could end up with people going months and in some cases years without paying their rates. And what does that mean? It means that you have to charge the people that do pay their rates more. At the same time, we also see some folks that seem to be very almost too strict, where we have seen penalties that are enormous, and then those penalties add to what a customer has to pay, and then they can't pay the penalty, and then they're back to the same situation of being cut off. So there's really a sweet spot in a lot of these areas that people have to work on. And again, not to overuse the metaphor, but you will be the artist for your community, and you'll have to kind of keep into consideration all of these different things when you're sitting down. If you do have really high rates, you may end up needing to be talking about some type of bill assistance program. This has become an enormous issue in many large utilities, and we're seeing many of the urban utilities creating assistance programs that didn't have them 5 and 10 years ago. It's still a tough thing for a small system to do, but we are seeing some states talk about setting up statewide programs. The state of California has been considering this for a number of years. So it is something that we're watching. That's the end of my formal presentation as far as just going through the tips. I'm going to spend just 2 minutes talking to you about some resources that go into a lot more depth of a lot of what I talked about, and then we're going to open it up for questions. We do have on our website, I think it's also on the Environmental Finance Center Network website, some guides, and this is just one example of designing rate structures that support your objectives. This was something that we did for the state of North Carolina a number of years ago, so it's not going to be perfect for Minnesota, but many of what I talked about, the issues I talked about, are described in here, and I think it would probably be many of the sections would be quite relevant for other states, and we have found other states using this guide. We also have lots of quantitative analysis. I showed you an excerpt of one of our statewide financial dashboards. Now, we don't have one for Minnesota, but we do have a couple in areas that are not far from Minnesota that might have some of the same community characteristics as Minnesota. So you may want to go to our website and spend some time looking at Wisconsin rates or Northern Illinois rates. And it will give you some idea of some of the rate setting practices that occur statewide. We also have tools that allow utilities to do some detailed utility-specific analysis. This tool on the bottom is an affordability analysis that we allow, that we help utilities use using census data. We have some general health checkup. So when I talked about knowing your financial condition in the beginning of this webinar, this is a little walkthrough tool that does kind of an automated report about your financial health. We have fairly complicated rate setting tools that will allow you to test the different scenarios I showed you with the example I showed, but it will also let you try an increasing block rate structure or a different, more complicated multiple customer class rate structure. So this is available on our website for download. We have a capital planning tool that lets you look at the impact of capital planning on your rates. What if you have to build a new water treatment plant or drill a new well in the coming years? What will that do to rates in the future? So these are all tools that you can get at. There are certainly other great tools out there outside of our network tools. EPA has a number of good resources. The American Water Works Association has good resources. We have some blogs as well that if we read a resource that we like, we'll describe it on our blog. If we do some research on rate setting practices, we'll write it on our blog. So if you're interested, all of these will be in the slide deck that you'll receive after the webinar. And then finally, we do offer one-on-one assistance. If after this call you decide that you would want our help with some type of rate setting, we do have some resources to do that directly, paid for as part of our EPA Smart Management for Small Water Systems. This is where you would go to fill out the application form for that assistance. And really the only requirement is that you're a small system serving 10,000 or less. I think I'm getting close to the end. This is again that link for that assistance. There are certainly state-specific resources. American Water Works, the Minnesota Rural Water Association is quite active, the Midwest Assistance Program. It really depends on the state whether these organizations do a lot on rate setting, but I urge you to talk to these associations as well. And if they're not working on rates, they certainly can help you with other key management issues. So that's my last slide. I'd invite you again to ask questions, and if we have a few questions, I'll take them. If we don't, I'll wrap up now, and we will be cutting off in 5 or 6 minutes. So any questions I don't get to, I do promise to answer, and we'll get back to you later. So Tess, I think you'll be able to give me some of the most pressing questions, and I'll do my best.
Great. Yes, we do have some questions. I'm also going to be sending everyone a link to the evaluation for this webinar in your chat box, so be prepared to receive that, and we will get to the questions as well. So the first question, Imagine that you're a small system that really hasn't looked at their rates in a long time. What would you recommend the first step be? How would you, if you haven't looked at your rates in a long time, get started?
That's a great question, and that's really how we start a lot of our assistance programs. We would do a lot of the steps I said. So we'd first figure out, what are the costs. But communication would start absolutely immediately. We would not make promises at the beginning. We would start to prep decision makers that, that they may have some hard decisions after we get through our effort. We have done this analysis and ended up with the rates need to double. And we know that is not going to be realistic in most small towns. What we would probably do is really work hard to promote a multi-year rate approval process so that we would get the governing board to not just approve rates for 1 year, but to go on record to say, yes, we're in tough shape. We haven't raised rates in 5 or 6 years. We're going to do a X% rate every year. And it really depends on where rates start. We've had communities that have approved a 19% rate increase every year for 5 years. That's pretty drastic. But in other situations, we've had pretty good luck with the 5 to 7% rate increase over 5 years. And then again, the cumulative nature of rate increases, after 5 years, you'll find yourself in a much better financial position. You still might be struggling, but if you wait 5 years and do 10% rate increase, which is what might be the alternative, if you just do the math, you're going to be in much worse shape. So that's the kind of thing that we would do. But I can't overstate the importance of communication. And if we could do it, we'd probably try to bring in some type of community rates advisory board that might be made up of like a community leader, maybe a local business person, so that they get to see some of the stresses behind the water system and that they could be an advocate for when you do come out with that recommendation. So those are some thoughts.
Great. And then kind of another question that harkens back to the beginning of your presentation. What kinds of things would be included in your fixed costs when you're, for a water system that's just starting to look at their fixed costs and break down their sort of. That's a great question. Absolutely, debt service is. I haven't found a bank yet that will say like, oh, can we pay you back less next year because we sold less water. So if you borrow money, then that's fixed. But then there's a lot of other fixed costs that long term they may be variable, like your staff costs. Well, you have the staff you have because you produce a certain amount of water. So are they fixed or are they variable? We would say that in most cases, staff costs, equipment costs are largely fixed, at least for the next 2, 3, 4 years. So those are the kind of things that are fixed. Really, the only thing that we find that's a pure variable cost that a utility could weather, a storm, literally, something came through, and they would see that if they sold less water, they would have less costs, are things like electricity, chemicals, water purchases. So if the person asks the question, and they buy a lot of their water from a larger utility, then they may have some high variable costs. But most everybody else on the phone, if they did this exercise, they're probably going to find that their fixed costs are anywhere from 60 to 90% of their costs. And we've done this analysis dozens of times, and that's usually what we find. Great. Well, I think that's just about all the questions that we have today. So on that note, I really think we can close up. If you have any closing comments, again, that evaluation was sent out to everyone on the call, so feel free to fill that out. And Jeff, I'll let you close it out.
Okay, well, I just appreciate having the opportunity. I've been doing this work for, as Tess said, for 30 odd years, and it is a very hard task that you're all tasked with, and I I sincerely wish you the best, because setting rates, particularly in small water systems, it is painful for sure. But the stakes are quite high, and if we can be of help, please let us know.
Thanks, and have a good day.